Welcome to another episode of Books and Bytes.
Today we're getting into the world of Albert Camus, a really major figure in 20th century thought.
And we're focusing on one of his key works, The Myth of Sisyphus and Other Essays. We're going to, dig into the main ideas based on the material you shared with us.
Definitely. And just to be clear, this isn't going to be some stuffy philosophy lecture.
No, not at all. We want to unpack Camus' thinking and see how it still speaks to us, to our actual lives today. It's about pulling out insights, right?
Exactly. Because Camus, even when he's deep in philosophy, he's fundamentally talking about being human. And in Sisyphus, he's really wrestling with that feeling of the absurd.
Right, the clash between our deep need for meaning, for things to make sense, and, the universe just not seeming to care either way.
That indifference, yeah. And Camus wasn't trying to build some rigid system right off the bat.
No, his goal, as he put it, was more like diagnosing an intellectual malady of his time.
Using the absurd as a starting point, not the end conclusion. And importantly, without immediately jumping to, big metaphysical claims or relying on faith.
So let's start where he starts, that really jarring question. Is life actually worth living?
And he connects it straight away to suicide. Calls it the fundamental philosophical question.
It seems like it should be a simple yes or no, but Camus points out, look at all the people who just keep asking, who live in that uncertainty.
It makes you think, doesn't it, about that gap between what we might say about meaning and how we actually live.
Yeah, he notes that contradiction. People who argue life has no meaning often live as if it does, like Nietzsche talked about.
And conversely, sometimes those who end their lives actually held a deep, maybe shattered belief in some kind of meaning.
It's complex, and Camus talks about this tendency to elude, to sort of dodge the issue.
Like finding ways to avoid facing that lack of built-in meaning. It could be faith, belief in progress, anything really.
But the biggest form of eluding for him is hope.
Right, but not everyday hope. He means hope for another life, a heaven, some ultimate reward that makes this life okay in retrospect.
And he sees that as a fatal evasion, like it sidesteps the reality of this life, the one we're actually in. It's almost a betrayal of it.
Crucially, he says that just because life might lack some grand, cosmic meaning doesn't automatically make it worthless. Those are separate things.
So the core question he forces us to confront is, does the absurd dictate death? Does recognizing meaninglessness logically lead to suicide?
That has to be tackled first. And this leads to what he calls absurd reasoning.
Which is like pursuing the logic relentlessly right to the edge, but without emotional drama, just based on the evidence.
Exactly. A kind of cold, hard look at the implications. He mentions Karl Jaspers, too.
Yeah. Jaspers hitting the limits of trying to make the world a neat, unified whole.
And Jaspers saw people tend to pull back from that edge, from that uncertainty. But Camus says no. We need to stay there, examine that state.
Which brings us to these absurd walls. This feeling isn't just for philosophers, right?
No, he says it can hit anyone, anywhere. That sudden feeling that things are off. He calls it a distressing nudity, a light without effulgence.
Like a clarity, but a cold one. No comfort in it.
Precisely. And because it's hard to grasp, he thinks we need to understand these feelings by looking at their consequences, how they affect our thinking, mapping out their terrain, so to speak.
He uses that analogy of the actor. We see the roles, the actions, and from that we get a sense of the person, even if we don't know their deepest self.
It shows his method. It's analysis, not claiming absolute knowledge. He admits we can't really know everything, so focus on appearances, the climate of absurdity.
So that climate is the beginning. The end goal is seeing the absurd universe and developing the mindset to face it clearly.
Now let's dig into the mind's role in this. Camus notes the mind's first instinct is sorting true from false.
But then it immediately runs into contradictions, like those self-refuting paradoxes Aristotle pointed out.
Yeah, like the liar paradox. It shows the mind bumping up against its own limits from the get-go. And he argues that understanding, fundamentally, is about trying to unify things.
We want the world to feel familiar, clear. We try to make it human-shaped, project our own ways onto it, anthropomorphism.
It leads to this nostalgia for unity, this deep ache for some single absolute truth that explains it all.
But, and this is key, just because we long for it doesn't mean it's actually attainable, right? He even brings up Parmenides and the concept of the one.
Saying that asserting total unity kind of paradoxically implies separation.
Mm-hmm.
The assertion itself is separate. It highlights that gap between what we wish we knew and what we actually can know.
We often just give practical assent to ideas, maybe ignore the deeper implications, because truly examining them might shatter our worldview.
And when the mind really tries to grasp reality head-on, Camus says, the world kind of cracks. We get fragments, not a smooth, comforting whole.
He's very direct about our limits. This heart within me I can feel, this world I can touch. There ends all my knowledge, and the rest is construction.
We can't even fully know ourselves. The self is always shifting, a stranger in a way.
So those old sayings, know thyself, be virtuous, they reveal that longing, that nostalgia, but also our ignorance. They're approximations at best.
We feel the world tree bark, water, but we don't know it in some ultimate sense. Even science, reducing things down,
Ends up using images, metaphors, electrons orbiting a nucleus. It's powerful, like poetry, but it's not final knowledge.
So this leads us to the nature of the absurd itself. It's not in us or in the world alone.
It's in the comparison, the clash, between what we want, reason, meaning, and what the world gives us. Silence, indifference.
Right, the gap between intention and reality, our reasoning and the illogical world. The bigger the gap, the stronger the feeling of absurdity.
It bursts out from that confrontation. Action versus a world that transcends our action.
He calls it a divorce. It exists only in that confrontation. It's the only bond, strangely enough, uniting us and the world in that moment.
And if we accept this absurdity as our one certainty, we have to follow its consequences.
You can't break apart that trinity. Man, world, and the absurd relation between them.
No absurd without human mind to perceive the clash, and no absurd outside this world we live in. It ends with death.
It's the first truth. And if it's true, we have to preserve it, not try to solve the problem by denying one of its terms.
Okay, so accepting this reality, this absurdity, leads to absurd freedom. How does that work?
Well, becoming conscious of the absurd binds you to it, yes.
Yeah.
But losing that hope for a future meaning, for transcendence, paradoxically makes you more available to the present.
Before the absurd, we live with goals, future worries, maybe a belief in ultimate freedom, even if reality disagrees.
But the absurd flips that. The illusion of meaning gets shattered by the certainty of death.
Thinking about the future, setting goals, it assumes a kind of higher freedom that Camus says isn't there. Death is the only guaranteed reality.
The absurd person realizes they were sort of trapped by that idea of freedom, adapting their life to purposes that weren't really theirs.
But seeing there's no inherent future purpose is what creates inner freedom now. He compares it to mystics surrendering to God, or ancient slaves accepting their lack of responsibility.
You feel released from everything outside the present, outside your own awareness, and your revolt against the absurd.
Then there's this idea about the quantity of experience.
Yeah, it's a bit paradoxical. The absurd pushes you to live more, experience more, but also teaches you that ultimately none of it has cosmic importance.
The value comes from being conscious of the experiences.
Exactly. Living to the max means being maximally aware of life, revolt, freedom. That awareness makes old value scales useless.
The only real loss is premature death, cutting off that potential for awareness.
Right. That extra life the absurd offers isn't about willpower. It's defined by the horizon of death. The absurd person chooses courage, reason, living without appeal, within their limits, judged only by themselves.
So what about ethics then? If everything is permitted, does anything go?
Camus is careful here. He says integrity doesn't need rules. The only code he could accept would be from God, but the absurd premise is there is no such God.
So other moral codes, even in moralism, look like justifications, attempts to impose meaning.
He starts from innocence. That famous line from Karamazov, everything is permitted, isn't a cry of joy for Camus.
It's more like a bitter recognition of fact, no divine rulebook.
Exactly. The absence of God doesn't make bad behavior attractive. It just removes one specific reason not to do it. The absurd doesn't liberate in that sense. It binds you to the consequences within this life.
It makes consequences equivalent in the grand scheme, maybe rendering remorse futile, but not actually recommending crime.
Right. If all experiences are ultimately indifferent, then concepts like duty lose their absolute grounding.
He gives examples of absurd lives to make this clearer, Dunwan.
Not just a seducer, but someone embracing many fleeting loves, knowing it's all temporary, rejecting illusions of eternal passion, liberating love by embracing all of it.
And the actor.
Living many lives, aware each is fleeting, mastering them, but knowing the final curtain falls. Facing the ephemeral nature of it all.
Then the conqueror.
Choosing action now, knowing it's ultimately useless cosmically, but doing it as if it mattered. Protesting against fate through action, even futile sacrifice. This leads into absurd creation, especially art. Living with the absurd takes constant thought, he says.
There's a kind of metaphysical honor in just enduring it without flinching.
And creation art is the ultimate absurd joy, he quotes Nietzsche. Art, in order not to die of the truth.
Art is the way to hold on to consciousness, fix its adventures. Creating is like living twice.
Existence for the absurd person is a kind of mime, he says, and creation is the grandest mime. It often follows that initial discovery of the absurd, that pause.
The goal isn't to explain, but to experience and describe.
The artwork marks the end of one experience, but also multiplies it, repeating world themes without pretending they have ultimate meaning.
The art itself is an absurd phenomenon reflecting that intellectual condition.
And common themes link the creator and the thinker, showing those contradictions. An absurd work triumphs not by proving something, but through the concrete act itself.
Thought giving up on unity celebrates diversity, which is where art lives.
He gives examples from fiction, too. Kirillov in Dostoevsky's The Possessed.
The logical suicide guy. God is necessary but doesn't exist, so indifference and self-destruction as revolt.
Though Camus notes Dostoevsky ultimately argues against this through faith later on.
And Kafka.
Kafka embodies the absurd, the paradoxes, the tragedy in the everyday, the absurd logic of the trial or the castle. Kafka doesn't give answers, he just presents the ambiguity. Which brings us finally to the central myth, Sisyphus.
The ultimate absurd hero, rolling that rock up knowing it will fall forever.
The key is his lucidity. He knows it's pointless, he's conscious of his fate.
And that moment when he walks back down the hill, fully aware, that's when he's superior to his fate. His consciousness is his strength.
Which leads to that famous line, one must imagine Sisyphus happy.
Not happy doing the pointless task, but happy in the awareness, in the struggle itself, in rejecting false hope.
Exactly. Finding joy in the defiance, in the consciousness of his condition, the present moment, the succession of presence. That's his eternity.
It's a call to live without appeal, except there's no higher court, like Oedipus saying, all is well, despite everything.
Turn that lucidity into a rule for life. Live with what you have. Know your limits.
It's a freedom limited by time, a revolt without a future guarantee, a consciousness aware of death.
A greater life isn't another life. It's rejecting even the appeal of legacy or posterity. The only truth is defiance.
He also connects this to sensory experience, like in the Algerian summer.
Yes, learning about the body, the world, through intense sensation. The link between knowing you'll die and passionately loving life now.
Everything that exalts life at the same time increases its absurdity. That line really hits.
The tragedy of the happy person in that summer. It's about living without cheating, not despairing, but not hoping for something else either. Embracing the implacable grandeur of this life.
Hope equals resignation, he says. To live is not to resign.
It's finding that invincible summer within, even in winter, braiding the white-black threads joy and suffering together.
Willing to live without rejecting anything, finding beauty even alongside suffering, that little coin from Tapasa.
Symbolizing both learned experience and that simpler worn-down happiness, ignorance and joy intertwined.
So, wrapping up this deep dive into the myth of Sisyphus, we've seen the absurd as this fundamental clash.
And Kim is called to reject escape through hope or transcendence.
Instead, embracing consciousness, revolt, finding freedom within limits, and really living in the present.
And showing that recognizing the absurd doesn't have to mean despair. It can fuel an intense life, even a kind of joy through acceptance.
So a final thought for you, the listener. How might embracing the present, really being here without leaning on future hope, change how you see your own daily life? What value might you find right now?
It's definitely something to chew on. If you want to explore these ideas more deeply, definitely grab a copy of Albert Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus and other essays. You can find a link in the description.
And subscribe to Books and Bytes.